In this video, I'll explore working with and setting web typography in ways inspired by print and magazine design. Historically, typography on the web has been, well, pretty bad, but that doesn't need to be the case. I'll start with this, just our pure sort of HTML with default CSS formatting, and I'll try to end with something a little bit like this. Along the way, I'll explore some modern CSS and design choices needed to allow your web typography to reflect some of the quality and beauty that perhaps is more traditionally associated with print design. I think it's a fun exercise to see something cool in print and then try to remake it for the web. So let's get started. My starter file already has all the HTML really that I need for this. I have my content here and I have it structured. It's basically an article with a header and a section with 3 paragraphs of content. And I've already brought in some of the information in the head, such as a link to the Google fonts that I want to use, as well as a viewport tag here to make sure that this works on mobile. My interest really is in the CSS, and I'm just going to embed the styles right here within the document here. And we'll begin with some simple things that I like to do in most all of my documents. So one of the things that I always like is to make sure that I'm working with box sizing and using border box so that my padding doesn't add to the overall size of my content. So I'm going to go ahead and use an universal selector and just apply that everywhere. I often will add a CSS reset to my styles to get rid of any of the default styles that are present. But for this, I'll just plan to overwrite some of those styles that I know that I want to work with. That includes getting rid of any of the margin that's on the body. Right now, I've got just about an 8-pixel margin there. I usually will get rid of that and potentially set some of the spacing through padding or margins on my interior content. So certainly one of the mistakes I have right now is having that content directly against the edge. So I'm going to actually take the article container here and give it some padding. I think I actually right now might choose the 10 Vmax unit of measure, and so viewport units to the max would mean that whether that's a width or height, whichever one is greater is the max. And so I'm having 10 viewport units either on their height or width. And that means that that margin would expand and kind of contract based on, we'll get more margin or less margin based on whether or not we are the width of our browser window. So you'll see that that margin does kind of change around or expand and contract as we work with this. Certainly having anything that's butted right up against the edge is a no-no, and we want to have a little bit of breathing room and space, as well as reduce the overall measure or line length of our type. So having a little padding is going to be useful in that regard. Let's keep rolling along, and what I'd like to do is start defining some of my fonts. And so I know that my header here I had planned already and brought in a Google font called Open Sans to be part of that font family. So let's go ahead and add that, and that is going to be Open Sans. And I'll back that font up with any sans serif in that case. And then the paragraphs that I have inside of the section, so all the content in the section, or all of my paragraphs really, in this case, will all use the same font as well. And I had chosen a really nice serif font called Laura. And I'll back that up, in this case, with Georgia if Laura isn't available. And then I'll have any default serif in that case. And right away, choosing some better fonts on the web compared to the defaults is giving us a little bit better result there. Let's quickly push this forward, and so into my header here, I really wanted a much larger font size for that, and I'm going to use probably right around 6 VW as a font size, so viewport width size there to really bring up the size of my header and make that a little bit more dynamic. I'm going to add a text transform to that as well to make that uppercase. And so we'll make an uppercase text transform to get this a little bit better. And then there's a few other things I might want to do with this. So in this case, I feel like the letter spacing is just a little bit too wide with that. So I'm actually going to say that I want that just a little tighter, maybe 1 pixel. As well as my line spacing, I feel like when I don't have any ascenders or descenders, that line height could be a little bit better. And so I might just say that I want it 1 or maybe 1.1. 1.2 is about the default, there. So I might go to like 1.1 in terms of the line height for that content. And so depending on how I've got this set up and sort of what size I'm using, I might have a little bit different sort of font sizes in there, a little bit bigger or whatnot. I would like this maybe to sort of break a little bit differently depending on our size. And I'm going to lower this padding down just a little bit, at least in my preview. I'd like it to be able to break, just have 2 lines there, at least for now. We'll come back to this in a minute. Okay, I actually think I'm going to make my letter spacing just a little bit tighter. It gets a little loose at that size with these all caps. And then one other thing is that I might define my font weight. And I'm actually only getting one font weight. It's the OpenSens 700 that I've brought in. So that's a bold font weight. But I'm going to define that specifically to make sure that that's true. If I'm using a CSS reset or defaulted to a different font, I want to make sure that that's in bold there. So I'll add that in. Let's come to the typography below here, the paragraphs that are in the section. I do have one paragraph for the byline in the header as well, so that's taking on the Laura font here. But now I just want to address only those paragraphs in the section tag. And so I'll come to those, and maybe I want the font size just to be a little bit bigger than this. I might say that the default font size is about 16. I might go to 18, or if I wanted to use more of a relative unit of measure, I might say 1.15 or so in M, and see what that looks like in terms of that font size, and just sort of pump that up just a little bit for the fonts. One other thing for this is that I feel like the margin, when it comes to paragraphs, oftentimes is a little more than I want. So the separation between each of the paragraphs is a little bit more than I want. I could take the margin off and have no margin whatsoever, but I do want a little bit of bottom or top margin on our elements. So I might say that I want maybe like 0.5 em, about a half margin there, and really no margin on the left and right. And that just sort of changes the spacing there and doesn't space it out quite so much as some of the other the defaults here, which will put things kind of farther apart than sometimes I'd want them to be. Moving along, let's take a look at the line height here. And so the line height is a little tighter than I would normally choose, or the leading for this. So in the default is about 1.2, and I find a little wider, like about 1.5 is a little nicer. You don't want to get too wide where it just looks like strips of text, but 1.5, 1.4 in there is a pretty nice value for a lot of typesetting. And so I'm going to go ahead and apply that. And let's get a little more fanciful for this. So certainly one of the things that we could think about is our measure. And so I could reduce in the section itself, I could reduce the width of that section. So maybe I only want it like 50% of the screen or something like that. We could do it that way. Or one of the ways that we could work with this and the type is to use different columns. So I could have a column count and say, hey, I want 2 columns in there. One way to do that though is with a column width, and you could specify like the number of characters you want in a column. So 40 characters in a column, something like that. And then if I have a wider screen, I'll get more columns, right? And so it's basically giving it about, a suggestion for column width, and then depending on how wide your screen is, you'll get different sort of effects here and different columns as we go. So I'll take a look at that and get a little bit wider. Now I might want to have more of a gap. If I had, columns, I might say that, hey, I've got, at least a 20 pixel column gap or a 30 pixel column gap, or we could translate that to M's as well, and 2M column gap to just have a little bit more space that's there. You can also put like a rule through your column and play around with the techniques for working with columns in CSS, but that's kind of cool. I've got like a 2-column layout now going on with my section. Let's play around with a couple other things. Let's say what I wanted to do is also indent my text. So what I might do is use a text indent for my paragraphs, and I'll choose about 4 characters of indent, and you'll see that each of these indent. I don't feel like this is 100% critical because I'm already getting separation through spacing to see that I've got a new paragraph. And the one thing that if I did have a text indent that I wouldn't necessarily want to do is indent the very first paragraph. That's not common in typography. That you wouldn't indent the very first paragraph. It's really just subsequent paragraphs, and the indentation is an indicator that it is a new paragraph. The first one, you always know it's the start of a new paragraph, so you don't need that on the first one. So if I wanted to take that away, what I might do is reference my section P and just say, hey, if you're the first of your type, which is a nice pseudo selector to get the very first paragraph within the sections, and then we could take off that text indent on that particular one, say that that's 0, and then I don't get the text indent on that very first paragraph of its type. But every subsequent paragraph in the section will have a little bit of text indent to them. And so we can start to set this a little bit more nicely. These kinds of pseudo selectors are really, really useful for targeting particular things. So sometimes in print, you'll see like the first line set a little bit differently. So what I might say is if I'm the first paragraph within my sections and I'm on the first line, I could use a sort of double pseudo selector here to get at exactly what I want. Well, maybe then I want to be in uppercase, and you'll see that very first line only gets to be in uppercase. Perhaps I decide to bold that particular thing just to give a little style to the very first line. When I bold it, I feel like the font size gets a little bit bigger than I wanted, so maybe I'm going to reduce that down to like 0.9 em instead, and we can take that down in size just a little bit and play around with kind of what this might look like for that very first line. Certainly the way that this is stacking up right now, my byline is too close to this other content. I really want the byline to be maybe either more connected to the title or at least more separated from the other content. So I could play around with that byline. That's in a header paragraph. So I might move up right here where I start defining my paragraphs and work with that byline. So I could give it a font style of like, maybe I want that to be in italic, and I do have an italic font installed, so we can use the Laura italic, which is nice. But I also might want to have some margin on that. Like if the margin on the bottom was a lot bigger, perhaps we could play with that just to push things down somewhat. So I'm not exactly sure what value I want here, but let's say we just gave it 100 pixels. That's more than I needed necessarily, but just kind of pushing some of this other content down. The margin on the top could be a little bit less, perhaps, but I'll leave it there and adjust some of that stuff later. But I know that I want to play with my spacing, but also kind of get that byline. Now, I'm going to come back to these pseudo selectors, and that very first character there, I might want to use a drop cap on. So we can explore doing that. And so what I'll do for that is say, hey, if we're in the section paragraphs and we are the very first one, so that's called first of type, and we're the very first letter. So we can do first line, but we could also do first letter. We could do something kind of special with that first letter. And so what I want to do with that is maybe make it a bolder, bigger thing. And so I'm going to say that the font size there is going to get quite a bit bigger, like maybe 96 pixels, a lot larger in size. And once I do that, I might need to float it to the left so that the other content flows around that particular content. I might want to use the same sort of font family that I'm using up here with my header. So the font family I was using there was the Open Sans font family. And so if I wanted a different sort of style for this one, I might use that Open Sans font. And the line height here might not be correct. I have a huge font size, but I might need to play with my line height to sort of bring this down in size. So as I do the line height, I can sort of reposition and kind of figure out, and I might need to try some different positions here to sort of figure out what kind of line height is going to work for allowing my content to break underneath as I want, and sort of align that type as I want. It's a little too tight there, so I do want a little bit of potential padding around there or margin on that. So I could do that maybe with a little bit of padding around the outsides of this. Let's say I gave it about 6 pixels of padding. I could say 0 on the top and bottom where I don't seem to need it right now, and then give it like, I don't know, maybe 8 pixels on the right, and I'm going to go 0 on these other values. So I only have padding really more on the sort of right hand side, and that's starting to align as I like, giving me a nice drop cap. So you'll have to play with some of these numbers when it comes to the the drop cap stuff, and see exactly kind of what works for you. But floating and enlarging your that first letter can be a nice sort of feature here. Let's return to the headline that I've got here. And in the print example, the way that this is set is it's got some differentiation here. It's using an ampersand, and the before words part is sort of smaller. It's kind of on the center alignment that's there. And so let's play around with setting some of that. And so that's my H1 that's here, and I'll continue with that. So I could play with a text alignment to the center to make sure that that content is aligning to the center. I might do the exact same thing with my header paragraph. So that one is also under a center alignment. Okay, now that I've got that, I really wanted before words, which is maybe kind of a little intro part. I want to break down my title, and so not the hierarchy of this, not maybe every word is as important. I wanted to feature perception and cognition, and maybe make sort of and before words a little bit different. So different color, different style, etc. Now, in order to set some of this typography differentially, I'm going to need to be able to target those things within our CSS. And there isn't really a way to say, hey, I want to target the third word in something or the fifth character of something. So we do have the ability to do the first word, first line, but not necessarily like, hey, I want the sixth word or something. And so you might turn to some JavaScript for that. There's a framework called Lettering.js, a JavaScript jQuery plugin that people will use, and that would take every single character and wrap it in a span tag for you automatically. So that would be a way to do that. But I'm just going to go ahead and wrap some spans around these things to sort of differentiate the pieces that I know I want to be different. So I'll add a span class. Maybe I'll just call this one before, because that's the content that I'm sort of playing with here. And so I'm going to wrap that span around the words before words. I'm also going to wrap a span around the and that's here. So I'll put a span around that, and I'll give that a class of and simply wrap a span tag around this and that's there. And I wanted to turn that and not into the word and, but instead use an ampersand for that. And so in order to use the sort of ampersand, I could put in the special character that represents the ampersand, which is going to be this amp. So the ampersand / amp will turn that into an ampersand character inside of mine. And so I needed to use a special character for that, just like I'm using special characters for real quotes and for an M dash right here, which would be properly setting that. I've already done some of those special characters in my HTML. But I wanted that to be an ampersand, and I need to be able to target those things. So sometimes this is where you kind of don't fully separate your style from your content. In order to get at this specifically, I did need to be able to target those things through CSS. But now I've got these spans that will allow me to target the before class and the and class and kind of do some special things with those. So because I'm sort of in the header, I'm going to go ahead and organize my code up here. And I'm going to specifically reference those things. So if it's the before class of the header, I'll go ahead and change the color of that. So I'm going to make that more of a gray color to that particular content. So I'm going to use maybe BBB for that to sort of turn that into some more of a gray color. So this is the H1 span that has the before class. So I need to be, I don't have a class on the H1, I have it on the span that's in the H1. And so there we go, we can turn that into color. I also wanted the ampersand to be that color, so I could just string that on here and say that if I have this, if I'm an H1 span of and, I also have that color that's there. I might display both of these as block elements so that they make the break that I wanted in this case. And then I need to sort of work with them individually. So in this particular case, I did want the H1 span of before to be a smaller size, maybe about half the size of the other one. So I'm going to use font size 3 VW instead of 6. And the ampersand I actually wanted to be really large in this case, and I'm going to overlap this other content with that ampersand as well. So we'll have to play around with that. But this H1 and is going to be a much larger size. So I'm going to come down here to that, and the font size that I wanted, and I'll probably have to play with this size, but I've sort of been, I'm going to go ahead and maybe make that quite a bit larger, maybe double the size of my other type. And then we're going to have this stuff kind of overlap each other as well as we go. So we're going to have to play with the margins. Now, all of this content does get a little bit bigger as we make our screen a little bit different size. So we can see that this gets a little larger as we kind of play around with the size. I did want to have a little bit more style, like some drop shadows or outlines around my type in the H1. So I'm going to come on here and play around with that through text shadow. And you can string a bunch of different text shadows together. But let's say I had 2 pixels by 2 pixels with no blur there, and I wanted that to just be, so depending on this, like I could have a black shadow around, let's say it was just red around the outside, you can kind of see what's happening. It's offsetting just a little bit. But these will stack on one another. And so what I might do is start with a sort of white shadow and then string that with a 3 pixel, so a slightly more offset, 3 pixel by 3 pixel, and then black shadow that's on there. And I can have sort of the white and then a little bit of a black outline that's under there, just to give this a little bit more style. I might go the other way with this and string it as well. You can also go in the negative direction. So I might go -1, -1, and we could kind of get like a little red outline on the other side. I do want that once again to be white, and then I'll string a -2, sort of -2 black outline. And we're kind of getting like this sort of weird outline around the outside. That's not working for the gray ones, but it's kind of giving a little bit of depth perhaps, or kind of an interesting outline on these two, but not necessarily these other ones. And so I'm going to play with by taking that text shadow off of these other ones that I don't want it on. So I'll say text shadow there of none, and kind of remove it where I don't want the text shadow. So I'm giving a little dimension or character through shadow. Yeah, I don't want it to apply everywhere, perhaps. Okay, now I just need to kind of get into the margins on these things. And so I'll play around with the margins of these. Let's go ahead and I'm going to start by giving them like sort of zero margin, and we'll play with the margin specifically on the on some of these other elements that are there. So I could the margin for um, some of these other elements could change. Right now they're all set to margin 0 and they're still getting a little bit of a stack, and some of that has to do with this line height that's there. So like there's quite a bit of line height that's separating some of this content out. So if we change the line height, we'll also change kind of the margin or the space in between a lot of these things. So I'm going to go up here to where I could do that and try a smaller line height here. Like let's say the line height was more like 20% of where it was. I'm going to say 20%. Or in that case, you'll see that this gets a lot tighter together and they start to overlap one another there with that line height. So I'm getting a little overlap between each of these things in that case. Now, I wanted, in this case, these are stacking in such a way where perception is underneath the ampersand that's there. And so to change that and make sure that the ampersand always drops into the background, because we've got a kind of z-index that's stacking here, and every subsequent thing we add is on top of the other things. So it's kind of an interesting effect to go behind one and top of the other, but I do want it behind both perception and cognition in this particular case. And so in order to get that, what I need to do is target that ampersand. And so that's right here in my CSS. I'm going to give it a position of relative and then tell its z-index to be -1. And so that should push it into the background behind all the other elements. And so we can give that more of a stacking type of style there with the z-index of that. And so that's starting to look better. I'm going to save my file here, kind of play this out and see what it looks like in a more full screen design. So as I bring this a little bit larger, we can kind of see what's happening with that, with the ampersand being in between these. I could play this even further, maybe if I wanted perception and cognition to get a little closer together. I do think that the before words part is a little bit too close. So I want to give a little separation there. So let's come back to our design and we'll play this back. See if I can't get this back into the right spot here so that we can kind of see some of this and change our code correspondingly. So I wanted the space there with before words, which is we are dealing with right there, to be a little bit different. So I gave it a line height of only 20%, which is really sort of tight. So maybe that shouldn't have been universal to both of those things. I could have taken that off where they both don't have that line height and just put them specifically to the ones that sort of needed it. So I guess really that I like that spacing, the sort of default spacing a little bit better on the before part, and then the line height on the ampersand, I wanted the overlap to happen. So I think that's looking a little bit nicer. I could play around with the letter spacing here on this other one. Maybe I space those out just a little bit before words, or try something else with that that's a little bit different than what I'm doing with perception and cognition here. So I had tightened it before, but even just going to 0 instead of, I think I had, by default, I had a -2, but as the fonts get smaller, that gets a little tighter than I wanted. So I might adjust that and take that away. because it was inheriting the -2 that I had on the header overall. Okay, so this is looking a little bit better. But then, of course, in my print example, I have it all rotated and it's on different sides of the screen in terms of the type. So let's go ahead and play with that. In this particular case, to rotate that, I'm going to be using a text transform, not a text transform, but a transform. And I'd like to rotate sort of everything, including the byline that's in the header. So seeing down here in my HTML, I've got both the H1 and that paragraph with the byline in there. And so what I might do for that is rotate the entire header. So I'm going to go right here, reference the header itself. We'll add a transformation to it, and I'll say that I wanted to rotate that maybe 20 degrees. Actually, I want it to go the other way, so I can say -20 degrees, and we'll rotate it on that sort of axis that's there. Now, sometimes once you rotate it, you might also need to translate it to move it up or down or left and right, because rotations will affect that. But I did want my content to be sort of some of it on the left and some of it on the right. And so what I might do is say that I want the header area to take up but like I want both the header area and the section area to only be about 50% in width. So I'm going to say width 50% so that they can be side by side once we kind of get this rolling. And to put them side by side, I could come up to the article that's here and tell that to display as flex. By default, they'll kind of put into a column, a couple sort of side by side sort of columns that will happen. And what we might do with that is also make sure that we're sort of justifying the content so that it is in the center of the respective columns. It's not going to do much right here, but I also want to align these. So I'm going to say align items so that we also get a vertical centering of those particular things. So I'll say align items, center, and then that content will kind of come more into the center of the document. I want to make sure my article takes up the entirety of the page, so I'll say 100 VH, and so that both of them kind of move down into the center. I feel like the padding around the outside is too much now, so I'm going to say maybe only 3 pixels of padding on there, and we got to be able to see kind of the other end of this. So I'm going to pull this design out to kind of see what we've got going here. Coming off that edge a little bit too much, and so let's make sure that we adjust that as we sort of play around with this. And I don't necessarily need the columns anymore, but that's looking kind of cool in terms of the header that's there. Okay, so these arrangements are a little weird. I got this kind of somewhat off screen. Let's bring this over. That spacing on the right seems a little bit more than I wanted, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize that and change this out to get that spacing a little bit better. So in the section itself, I'm not 100% sure that I want the columns there, but I do want maybe a little bit more padding around that particular section. I'm going to go ahead and say 2 VW of padding around the outside, maybe only on the left and right. So I'll save that out and bring this content back over, just giving me a little bit more space for each of these things. And I'm pretty close to where I wanted to be with this in terms of the sort of print example of this, which is actually only in 1 column, and sort of the web version of that. So that some of the ride along the way, there's a few things I think that are interesting in here. Is some of the text transforms that are part of this. One thing that could be cool with this is to move things around. So depending on our size, I'm going to go ahead and take this content and wrap that there, and so that we can kind of see this. And then if this one needs to go on this side. But if you wanted to move this content sort of up or down or left and right, sometimes with the rotation you might use a translate. So let's say I translated it on the Y and I moved it 100 pixels or something like that. I could move it up or move it down, which you might need to do to get this sort of more in the right spot. So if we were translating that, we could move like I need this higher up or I need it, further down. I could adjust this. And once you rotate something, it can sort of affect its positioning a little bit. And you might need to sort of shift it around through some translates that are there. And so I might see if I wanted that to be a little bit higher like that, I can have that translate on there, or I could take that off. I don't really feel like I need it so much in this case if I've got sort of a full screen look. All right, so one last little tour through the code. That was my typography exploration. Hopefully you learned a thing or two along the way or got some ideas about how you might set your type. Working with transforms, working with multiple shadows, just making sure that your paragraphs and types have appropriate sort of measures and line lengths, and you've made good choices about fonts, maybe doing drop caps. Those kinds of things are all part of the exploration we had in order to be inspired by print design and realize a cool design on the web.